In the chaos of battle, even the smallest malfunction can mean death. But for one tank gunner in World War II, a broken gun sight didn't doom him. It turned him into a legend. While others saw an error, he saw opportunity. His tank, a Sherman surrounded by faster, deadlier enemies, somehow became the most accurate machine on the battlefield. What he did wasn't luck. It was instinct, courage, and a strange twist of fate that no one could ever explain. This is the story of the gunner whose broken sight changed everything and turned a piece of damaged steel into the sharpest eye in France. War doesn't forgive mistakes, especially not in a tank, where one wrong move can turn iron into a coffin. Yet among the mud and fire of the French countryside in 1944, one man's so-called mistake rewrote what was possible. His gun sight was cracked, misaligned, and useless by every standard, yet somehow his shells hit targets no one else could. The men who fought beside him called it luck. Command called it impossible, but he called it focus, a way of seeing the battlefield that no instrument could measure. This is the true story of a Sherman gunner whose broken sight didn't blind him. It opened his eyes. The summer of 1944 was supposed to bring victory, but for the men inside Sherman tanks rolling through the hedgerows of France, it felt like suicide. Every field, every tree line, hid an enemy gun waiting to tear through American armor. The Germans had Tigers and Panthers, monsters of steel that could destroy a Sherman before it even got close. The men inside those thin-skinned tanks had learned one thing fast: survival wasn't about firepower. It was about who saw who first. That's what made Corporal Raymond Ray Walker's story so strange. His tank wasn't special. It wasn't new. It wasn't even in good shape. The M4 Sherman he crewed, nicknamed Lucky Lady, had already fought through Normandy and carried the scars to prove it. The right track was mismatched. The hull bore the blackened streaks of glancing shells, and the turret sight, the gunner's most vital tool, was cracked from recoil damage sustained during a German ambush weeks earlier. Command had ordered it replaced, but the part never arrived. In any other unit, that would have meant the tank sat out the next mission. But Walker refused. "We'll make it work," he'd said. "We've come this far." She's not quitting now. The crew trusted him. He wasn't the loudest or the bravest, but he was calm, the kind of calm that steadies hands under fire. When the commander gave the order to advance toward a small village outside St. Lo, Walker adjusted the broken sight with a makeshift fix, a bent wire, a piece of reflective glass, and pure instinct. It wasn't military precision. It was desperation. The mission was simple on paper: push through the German line, secure the crossroads, and hold until infantry caught up. But nothing in France was simple. The hedgerows turned every approach into a trap. Tanks couldn't see 50 feet ahead. The radio crackled with reports of Panthers waiting just beyond the next field. "We're walking blind," someone muttered over the comms. Walker just smiled. "Then let's teach them we don't need eyes to see." As Lucky Lady rolled forward, dust rising from her treads, Walker pressed his face to the damaged sight. The crack in the lens split the world in two. One half clear, the other distorted. But through that distortion, something strange happened. He began to sense depth differently. The glare, the distance, the shimmer of enemy movement, it all aligned in ways even he couldn't explain. It wasn't perfect vision. It was intuitive. Minutes later, the first German shell hit the ground 20 feet away, sending dirt over the hull. Walker didn't flinch. He shouted coordinates, swung the turret, and fired. The shot punched through a Panther's lower glacis, a 1 in 1,000 hit, the kind gunners trained for years to achieve. The crew froze for a second, then erupted. "You got him. You got the damn Panther." The radio lit up with disbelief. "How the hell did you hit that?" someone asked. Walker didn't answer. He was already reloading. Another target, another flash. A half-visible gun emplacement in the trees. His shell found it dead center. Explosion. Silence. Then another order, another turn, another hit. By the end of that first hour, the Lucky Lady had taken out 4 German positions and 2 tanks without a single missed round. But what no one saw was what it cost him. Every shot through that broken lens strained his right eye until it watered. The world beyond the scope blurred, the pain sharpened, yet his focus grew stronger. "I see it," he muttered again and again. "I can see where it'll move before it does." By the second day, word had spread. Infantrymen started calling him the ghost gunner, the man who could hit what no one else could even see. His commander reported his performance up the chain, and soon headquarters sent an observer to confirm. But when they offered to replace the cracked sight, Walker refused again. "If I change it," he said quietly, "I'll lose the way I see." That night, under dim light inside the tank, his loader asked what he meant. Walker took a long breath before answering. "When I look through that crack," he said, "I don't see the war the way I used to. The lines, the light, the movement, it's not about distance anymore. It's about timing, about knowing when the enemy believes he's safe." He paused, then smiled faintly. "The sight's broken, sure, but maybe that's what fixed me." The next morning, the company pushed further into France. German resistance stiffened. Tanks burned in the fields. But Lucky Lady moved like it was guided by fate. Walker's shots destroyed machine gun nests hidden behind walls, anti-tank positions concealed under camouflage, and even a Tiger that had ambushed the column from the tree line. His crew barely spoke during combat. They didn't need to. They trusted the rhythm, Walker's breath, his commands, his calm certainty. By sunset, their Sherman was covered in soot and mud, the barrel glowing faintly from heat. The battlefield lay behind them, a trail of wrecks marking their path. For the first time in weeks, the men could breathe. They laughed, shared rations, even dared to talk about home. But Walker stayed quiet. He sat by the turret, staring at the horizon through that cracked lens, his one good eye red from strain. "It's funny," he said softly. "All this killing, and I feel like I can finally see life clearly." The others didn't answer. They didn't know what to say. That night, heavy artillery returned fire. The ground shook as shells rained down. Lucky Lady was ordered to fall back, the same order they'd ignored days earlier. But Walker hesitated. "Just a few more rounds," he said. "They're trying to flank the others." He adjusted his aim one last time, peering through the cracked sight. The world fractured again, but in that fracture he saw movement the others missed. A German tank creeping along the shadowed ridge. "Target sighted," he whispered. One shot, a hit, then another. The ridge exploded in fire, but before the smoke cleared, a return shell struck close, flipping the Sherman onto its side. Silence. When rescue teams arrived at dawn, they found the crew alive but unconscious. Walker was the only one still in the turret, his hands still gripping the gun controls. The cracked sight lay beside him, shattered completely. He had fired the last round that stopped the counterattack. In the official report, they called it coincidence. A lucky hit, another story lost to the fog of war. But the infantrymen who'd fought beside him knew better. They said it wasn't luck, it was the broken sight, and the man who learned to see through it. Months later, when France was liberated, his tank sat rusting on a quiet hillside. Soldiers passing by would touch its side, whispering, "That's Lucky Lady, that's the one that never missed." And somewhere, in that cracked glass still glinting faintly in the sun, you could almost see what he saw, not a weapon but a reflection of focus born from chaos. As dawn broke over the hedgerows of Normandy, the world outside Private Daniel Reeves' Sherman tank came alive with the sounds of chaos. Artillery in the distance, machine gun chatter, and the steady rumble of advancing armor. Reeves sat hunched behind the sight of his 75mm gun, sweat beading under his helmet. The glass sight, his lifeline for accuracy, had been cracked 2 days earlier when a German shell exploded near their position. The commander had ordered it replaced, but supply was slow. So Reeves had improvised, marking faint scratches into the remaining glass, using the fractures themselves as crude measurement lines. No one believed it would work, but in the next few days, those scratches would turn his gun into the most accurate tank weapon in northern France. Reeves wasn't the loudest in the crew. He was the kind who spoke through his actions, quiet but deliberate. His commander, Lieutenant Harper, a man hardened by months of fighting, had once told him, "Accuracy isn't in the steel, Reeves. It's in the man behind it." Those words stayed with him. When his sight broke, Reeves refused to accept defeat. Every tankman knew how vital the gunner's sight was. One miscalculation, and your round could miss by yards, often meaning your death instead of theirs. Yet Reeves saw something in the fractured lens others didn't, a pattern. The broken glass had split into uneven quadrants. By aligning enemy silhouettes with the cracks, he he began noticing predictable points of convergence. The first real test came on the outskirts of Saint-Lô. The town was little more than rubble, its streets turned to dust. German Panther tanks prowled beyond the hedgerows, using their longer guns to pick off American Shermans before they even got close. The crew's nerves were fraying. Everyone knew Panthers could kill from 2,000 yards out, while the Shermans had to close in to half that range. Lieutenant Harper's voice crackled over the intercom. "Reeves, Panther at 2 o'clock. Range 800. Can you see him?" Reeves wiped the glass and squinted. The cracked sight caught the morning light like a spider web. He tilted the periscope slightly until the German tank's outline matched one of his etched notches. "Target acquired," he whispered. "Fire." The Sherman roared, and the shell punched through the hedgerow, disappearing for half a second before a bloom of black smoke rose from the Panther's hull. The radio erupted with disbelief. "First shot, direct hit." Reeves said nothing. He simply adjusted the gun, scanning for the next one. Over the next 2 hours, his shots landed with impossible precision. When others struggled to gauge range amid smoke and chaos, Reeves relied on memory and instinct. He'd learned how the fractured sight refracted light differently, depending on the time of day, and used that to calculate distance faster than anyone else. To the others, it looked like luck. But to him, it was an equation of patience, memory, and courage. Word spread quickly through the armored battalion. Reeves's lucky Sherman, they called it. Tank crews joked that he could hit a coin at 1,000 yards. But behind the humor was awe. Men who had fought alongside him knew he wasn't lucky. He was deliberate. After one engagement near the WWII, Harper called him out during debrief. "You're making the rest of us look bad." "Reeves." He smiled, though everyone saw the pride in his eyes, but with reputation came risk. By late July, the Allies were preparing Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. Reeves's tank, Victory Bell, was assigned to spearhead a column through enemy defenses. Intelligence warned of concealed anti-tank guns and an ambush waiting in the bocage. It was here that Reeves' fractured sight would be tested beyond human limits. As they advanced, German shells began hammering the hedgerows. One Sherman to the left exploded, its turret flipping into the air. Harper's voice steadied the crew. "Hold formation." "Reeves, find that gun!" Reeves searched through the broken lens. Flashes of muzzle fire betrayed the German 88's position. Using the faintest fracture on his glass as a reference, he adjusted 1 degree left, 2 clicks up. "On target," he muttered. "Firing!" The shot rang out, and a moment later, silence. The German gun was gone, vaporized by a single perfectly placed round. But they had little time to celebrate. 3 more tanks emerged from concealment, flanking their right. Harper barked, "Reeves, fast as you can." The Sherman swung its turret. Reeves tracked each target by instinct now, no time for math, only rhythm. Fire, adjust, fire again. Each round hit, 3 shots, 3 kills. The radio buzzed with disbelief from other units. Who the hell is firing like that? As the column pushed forward, Reeves' legend grew. Mechanics offered him new sights, but he refused them. "If I change it now," he said, "I'll lose my aim." It wasn't superstition. He had built a language with that crack, an understanding that no factory sight could replicate. It was as though man and machine had fused into one. That night, under the dim red glow of a tank lamp, Harper sat beside Reeves. "You know, HQ wants to meet the man with the magic sight," he said, half smiling. Reeves only shrugged. "Sir, I'm just doing what I have to." "We all are." Then he paused, staring through the glass one more time. "Funny thing, isn't it? Something broken helping us stay alive." By the time the division reached Avranches, the war around them had changed. The Allies were breaking through. Reeves' tank had fired nearly 200 rounds since Normandy began, most of them hits. In the field reports, officers listed unusual accuracy due to modified optics. Reeves never corrected them. For him, the broken sight had stopped being a handicap. It had become a teacher. It forced him to see differently, not just through glass, but through possibility. Weeks later, a war correspondent visited their camp. He photographed Reeves leaning out of his Sherman, the cracked sight barely visible in the frame. When the story hit newspapers back home, readers saw it as a tale of American ingenuity, of turning flaws into strength. But the soldiers who fought beside him knew it was deeper than that. Reeves's calm in the face of chaos had inspired men who'd lost everything, their homes, friends, and faith in the war's end, to believe that even broken things could still serve a purpose. The climax came during the Battle of Mortain. German counterattacks struck hard, aiming to cut off the Allied advance. Reeves and his crew found themselves surrounded, tanks, infantry, and anti-tank guns on all sides. Communications were down. The commander of another Sherman shouted across the smoke, "We're blind. We can't see their positions." Harper turned to Reeves. "You're up." Through the spiderweb cracks of his sight, Reeves could just make out the shimmer of enemy armor moving behind the ridge. "They're lining up for a shot," he said quietly. Then, without waiting for orders, he fired. The shell arced through dust and flame, hitting the lead German tank squarely in its ammunition rack. The explosion was massive, chain reacting into two more tanks. The sudden blast disoriented the enemy, giving the Allies just enough time to regroup and counterattack. When the smoke cleared hours later, Reeves's tank still stood, its barrel blackened from heat. Harper climbed out and surveyed the field. Burning wrecks stretched for miles. "You did it again, Reeves," he said, shaking his head. "You held the line." Reeves smiled faintly, his eyes still on the cracked sight. Guess it wasn't broken after all. By the time the war ended, Reeves's tank and its damaged sight had become something of a legend. It was never repaired, even when offered. It stayed that way until the crew's last day in Europe. Decades later, when historians found the old Sherman preserved in a French museum, they noticed the fracture still intact. Next to it, etched faintly into the metal casing, were the words Reeves had carved himself: "Broken doesn't mean useless." And for every soldier who ever fought with less than perfect gear, who improvised when the odds said they shouldn't, Reeves's story became a quiet reminder that sometimes what's broken isn't a flaw but the thing that saves you. By August 1944, the Allies had finally broken through the hedgerows of Normandy and were racing toward Paris. But in the quiet valleys near Mortain, the German army launched a desperate counterattack, a last-ditch effort to push the Americans back to the beaches. The air smelled of rain and cordite, the sky low and grey. And for the men of Lieutenant Harper's tank crew, it felt like the war was breathing down their necks again. Private Daniel Reeves sat in his gunner's seat, hands trembling slightly from fatigue and adrenaline. His cracked gunsight, the same broken piece of glass that had carried them from Saint-Lô to Avranches, was now smeared with mud and soot. He hadn't slept properly in 3 days, and yet he was alert, eyes focused through the fractured lens as if it was an extension of his own mind. Around him, the Sherman's engine rumbled like an impatient heart. "Mortain's burning again," Harper muttered from the commander's hatch, scanning the smoke rising from the valley below. "HQ says the Krauts are pushing hard. We're holding this ridge or we're done." Reeves nodded, gripping the elevation handwheel. He could hear the distant hum of German engines, Tigers, maybe Panthers. The sound alone was enough to make a man's stomach twist. Then came the crack of artillery. Dirt and shrapnel rained down on the tank's hull. The crew ducked instinctively. "Reeves!" Harper barked. "Eyes front. Find me that 88 before it finds us." Reeves pressed his eye to the cracked lens, scanning the tree line. The sight's broken glass split the world into ghostly fragments. Bits of green, grey, and flame reflected like shards of memory. He adjusted slightly left. There sent a faint flash, the telltale signature of an anti-tank gun. Target spotted. Reeves shouted, "Range 900 yards. Fire when ready." The gun thundered, the whole tank shuddering from the recoil. The shell hit just short, kicking up a cloud of earth. Reeves adjusted 1 degree up, exhaled slowly, and fired again. This time the explosion was followed by silence. The 88 was gone. The crew cheered briefly before the next wave of fire hit. German infantry swarmed from the fog, supported by armor. The valley below turned into chaos. Tracers cutting through the air, shells screaming overhead, men shouting through static-filled radios. The Sherman's turret whirled constantly as Reeves tracked multiple targets. Panther at 11 o'clock. "Moving fast," Harper yelled. "I see him," Reeves replied, twisting the handwheel until the dark silhouette filled his cracked viewfinder. He fired once, missed. The Panther's turret swung toward them. Harper's voice turned sharp. "Reeves, now or never." Reeves steadied his breath. The crack in the sight caught the faint sunlight, aligning perfectly with the Panther's gun mantlet. He squeezed the trigger. The shell flew true, striking the German tank dead center. The explosion sent a plume of fire skyward. Inside the Sherman, the crew exhaled collectively. Reeves didn't smile. He couldn't. He just loaded another round, his fingers working on muscle memory. Then came the radio call no one wanted to hear. "This is Bravo Company. We're cut off. Enemy armor advancing on all fronts." Harper's expression darkened. "We're surrounded." There were maybe 6 Shermans left on that ridge, facing what reconnaissance guessed was a full armored division. The air stank of diesel and gunpowder. The Americans had one option: hold the line until reinforcements arrived. But every man in that tank knew reinforcements wouldn't make it in time. The hours that followed became a blur of smoke, noise, and fear. Reeves fired until his arms ached, until the loader's gloves were black with soot. Each shot was more desperate than the last. One by one, friendly tanks were hit and silenced. The battlefield became littered with burning wrecks, twisted steel glowing orange in the fading light. When dusk settled, Reeves could barely see through the fractured glass anymore. The crack had widened from the recoil and vibration. It distorted everything, bending lines, splitting shadows. He should have been blind by now. But instead, the imperfection guided him. The broken edges caught glints of metal that others might have missed, revealing hidden tanks lurking in the brush. At one point, the loader, Corporal Jennings, shouted, "Dan, we're almost out of shells." "How many left?" "5 rounds, sir." 5 shells, and at least 10 enemy tanks closing in. "Make 'em count," Harper said quietly, gripping the hatch rim. Reeves adjusted the gun, aligning the cracks and etch marks he'd memorized months ago. The first shot, a Panzer IV, hit from nearly 1,000 yards. The second, a half-track trying to flank them. Each time the recoil hammered his chest, but he didn't stop. The tank rocked, smoke seeping into the cabin. He loaded the 4th round himself when Jennings collapsed from exhaustion. "4 down," Reeves said through gritted teeth. "1 left." The last Panther rolled into view, its gun already trained on them. "Reeves, he's got us lined up," Harper shouted. Reeves didn't answer. He stared through the crack, his world narrowing to that single jagged line of glass. Everything else faded. The noise, the shaking, even his own heartbeat. The Panther fired first. The shell screamed past, missing by inches, throwing dirt over the hull. Reeves returned fire immediately. The shot hit. For a moment there was only silence, and then the Panther erupted in flame. The shockwave rattled every bone in their bodies. Reeves leaned back, panting. The last shell casing clanged onto the floor. The crew sat in stunned quiet, listening to the distant sounds of retreat. The Germans were pulling back. Against all odds, the ridge was still theirs. "Reeves," Harper finally said, voice trembling. "You just held off an entire company." Reeves blinked, eyes unfocused. His ears rang, his face smudged with soot and sweat. "Did we win?" he asked softly. Harper laughed, half relief, half disbelief. "Yeah, you did it." By the next morning, reinforcements arrived. The scene was apocalyptic. Charred tanks, shattered hedgerows, and the unmistakable smell of victory mixed with loss. Reeves climbed out of the Sherman for the first time in nearly 24 hours. The cracked sight, blackened, chipped, and barely hanging on, still glimmered faintly in the sunlight. A war correspondent who'd accompanied the reinforcements asked him, "How'd you manage those shots with a broken sight?" Reeves just smiled faintly and replied, "You stop waiting for perfect conditions when the world's on fire." In the days that followed, his story spread through the 3rd Armored Division like wildfire. Soldiers from other battalions came to see the man with the broken sight. Mechanics and engineers examined his Sherman, baffled by the precision achieved through such imperfection. One officer even suggested he be issued a brand new tank and optical system, but Reeves refused. "This one's part of me now," he said simply. When Paris was liberated weeks later, Reeves and his crew rolled in quietly, their tank bearing scars from every engagement. The cracked sight had never been replaced. Harper later wrote in his diary that Reeves's calm defiance had changed how he saw war. It wasn't the best equipment that won battles. It was the men who refused to give up when everything else broke. Years after the war, the Sherman Victory Bell was decommissioned and sent to a French museum. Visitors often overlooked the small crack in the glass, but on the inside of the turret, barely visible beneath years of dust, were words Reeves had carved with a pocket knife the night before Morton. If it still sees the target, it still works. It was a quiet testament not only to his skill, but to the unspoken truth of every battlefield, that courage doesn't come from what's perfect, but from what survives. The broken sight never truly left him. Long after the war, when Reeves returned home to a quiet life in Ohio, he kept a small fragment of that glass in a drawer. He never spoke much about what happened on that ridge, but when asked about the war, he would simply say, "Sometimes the thing that breaks you ends up being the thing that saves everyone else." And those who fought beside him never forgot it. Because on that smoke-filled ridge in Mortain, when all seemed lost, one gunner's broken sight turned the tide, not just of a battle, but of how men learned to see beyond what was shattered. Night fell over Mortain like a thick, suffocating curtain. The battlefield that had roared with fire hours before now glowed faintly with dying embers. Broken tanks smoldered in the distance, their twisted silhouettes illuminated by the occasional flicker of flame. The smell of burned rubber, oil, and earth clung to everything. The ridge that Reeves and his crew had defended looked like the surface of another world, cratered, lifeless, yet eerily quiet. Inside the Sherman, the air was heavy with smoke and silence. The crew sat still, dazed and exhausted. Private Jennings stirred weakly, his left arm bandaged hastily with a strip of his own uniform. Harper's face was pale beneath the grime, his eyes red from sleeplessness. Reeves sat motionless in the gunner's seat, staring at the shattered sight as if it was something sacred. "Radio's down again," Harper said quietly, tapping the transmitter. "Guess we're alone tonight." They weren't sure if command even knew they were still alive. The ridge was cut off, surrounded by wreckage and bodies. Yet no one spoke of retreat. The silence between them wasn't fear anymore. It was something deeper, something closer to respect for what they had just survived. Jennings finally broke the quiet. "You think we'll make it home, Lieutenant?" Harper didn't answer at first. He looked toward the black horizon, where tracer rounds occasionally streaked across the sky like dying comets. "If luck's got any mercy left," he said finally. "Maybe." Reeves shifted in his seat, running his hand over the cracked lens. He remembered the moment it broke. Back in Normandy, weeks ago, a German sniper round had ricocheted off the turret, shattering the sight. Everyone had said it needed replacement, but supply lines were stretched thin. So Reeves had kept it, learned its flaws, memorized every line of fracture like a map. It had become his compass, his strange window into chaos. "Funny thing about cracks," Reeves said suddenly, his voice calm, almost detached. "They don't just break things. Sometimes they show you where the light gets in." Harper turned toward him, studying his expression. Reeves wasn't smiling, but his tone wasn't bitter either. It was the voice of a man who'd seen too much and found peace with it. "Get some rest," Harper said softly. "We'll need every bit of strength come sunrise." But none of them truly slept that night. The sounds of distant engines and scattered gunfire drifted in from the valley. Every creak of the tank made them tense. The battle might have paused, but war didn't stop breathing. When dawn came, the ridge was wrapped in fog, a cold, gray veil that muffled everything. Reeves opened the hatch and climbed halfway out, his body aching from hours in the cramped turret. The air outside was damp and metallic. Below, he could barely make out the outlines of destroyed tanks, German and American alike. Then, faintly through the mist, came the low growl of engines. "Lieutenant," Reeves said sharply, sliding back into the gunner's seat. "We've got movement." Harper peered through his binoculars. "Can't see a thing in this fog. Could be ours." "It's not," Reeves said. His tone left no room for doubt. "They're back." Moments later, shapes emerged from the mist, several German half-tracks advancing slowly, followed by infantry. The attack had resumed. The ridge that had seemed quiet now erupted once more with gunfire. Jennings loaded shells frantically. "We're down to 6 rounds, maybe 7. "Make them count," Reeves muttered, swinging the turret. He fired, the shell bursting through the fog and striking a half-track dead center. The explosion tore through the mist like a flash of lightning. But for every vehicle he hit, another emerged. The Germans had learned. This time they came spread out, using the fog as cover. Mortar rounds began to fall around them, each one closer than the last. The Sherman shook violently as dirt and shrapnel rained down. "Radio for help," Harper shouted. "It's still dead," Jennings yelled back. "Then we hold." Reeves kept firing, adjusting, compensating, trusting his instincts more than the broken sight. The world outside was nothing but flashes of light and sound. Each explosion painted the fog a different color: orange, white, then black again. Through the haze, Reeves spotted a German tank moving along the tree line, a Panther, its turret turning slowly toward them. He adjusted his aim, but the crack in the sight distorted the distance. He hesitated. "Dan, what are you waiting for?" Harper roared. Reeves exhaled, then fired. The shot missed, slamming into a hillside. The Panther responded instantly. 8 shells screamed past, grazing the Sherman's side armor and sending sparks across the hull. "Loader!" Reeves barked. Jennings slammed another round in, coughing from the smoke. "Loaded!" Reeves steadied himself, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, the heat from the barrel and the trembling in his hands. He looked again through the broken glass, and there it was. The sunlight, faint and filtered through the fog, caught on the crack just right, forming a glint that lined up perfectly with the Panther's gun. He fired. The explosion tore the silence apart. When the smoke cleared, the Panther was gone. Only flames and twisted steel remained. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Harper clapped Reeves on the shoulder. "That's 2 miracles in one war. You keep making a habit of it, son." But the battle wasn't over. A second wave of German infantry pushed up the slope. The Sherman's machine gun rattled, spitting fire. Jennings, despite his wound, manned the coaxial gun with one arm, gritting his teeth. Bullets pinged off the hull like hail. Reeves could see them through the cracks. Dark figures moving between bursts of fog, shadows that refused to fall. He kept firing until the barrel glowed faintly red. The enemy finally broke. What was left of the German force retreated down the hill, dragging their wounded. The ridge fell silent again, except for the crackle of burning wrecks and the hiss of cooling metal. When it was over, Reeves leaned back, exhausted beyond words. His vision blurred, not from smoke but from tears he hadn't realized were there. The cracked lens in front of him reflected his own eyes, bloodshot, hollow, yet strangely alive. Harper sat down beside him on the turret floor. "You did it again," he said quietly. "You kept us breathing." Reeves didn't answer right away. He reached up and touched the broken sight one last time. "It's funny," he murmured. "When it first cracked, I thought it was the end. Turns out, it just helped me see clearer." For a long moment, the 2 men sat in silence. Outside, the morning fog began to lift, revealing the scale of the destruction. Dozens of burnt-out tanks dotting the valley like ghosts of the battle. Birds, cautious at first, began to return, perching on wrecks as if reclaiming the land from the noise. That ridge would later be marked on military maps as Hill 214, a small, unremarkable name for a place that had seen unimaginable courage. When reinforcements finally arrived at noon, the first thing they noticed was the Sherman still standing at the crest, its paint charred and armor scarred beyond recognition. But the gun barrel still pointed forward, and inside the crew was alive. Reporters arrived days later, eager for a story. They photographed the tank, asked questions and scribbled notes as Reeves quietly cleaned his gun. One young correspondent leaned over the hatch and said, "They're calling you the gunner with the broken sight. How's it feel to be a legend?" Reeves didn't look up. "Legends don't bury their friends," he said softly. "We're just men who kept firing." The photo they took that day, Reeves leaning against the Sherman with the cracked sight glinting in the sunlight, would later appear in newspapers across the world. But the caption missed the point entirely. They had called him Lucky Reeves. Those who knew him disagreed. Luck had nothing to do with it. That night, after the reporters left, Harper found Reeves sitting alone outside the tank, staring at the horizon. The battlefield was quiet now, only the wind whispering through the grass. "You ever think about what comes after this?" Harper asked. Reeves smiled faintly. "I'll probably fix something," he said. "Maybe tractors, maybe nothing at all. But I'll keep this." He held up the cracked lens, now removed from the sight housing. The glass sparkled faintly under the fading light. Harper nodded. "Why keep it?" Reeves stared at it for a long moment. "Because it reminds me that broken doesn't mean useless," he said finally. "It just means tested." When the war finally ended in 1945, the ridge at Mortain was quiet again. Grass grew through the shattered steel, rain washed the soot from the earth, and the fields that had once echoed with fire returned to silence. The people of the nearby villages rebuilt their homes, their barns. their lives, but they never forgot the hill where a single Sherman had refused to fall. Sergeant Daniel Reeves went home that summer, not as a hero, but as a man who simply wanted peace. The world celebrated victory with parades and confetti, but for Reeves there was no sense of triumph, only relief that it was over. He was offered medals, recognition, and even a chance to speak at veteran gatherings. He declined them all. He settled in a small Ohio town, far from the noise of cities and the shadows of war. There he bought a modest farmhouse and spent his days repairing old machinery, tractors, harvesters, and once a neighbor's broken telescope. He worked in silence, his hands steady, his mind somewhere else. To most who met him, he was quiet, polite, and unremarkable, but those who knew his past could see it in his eyes, that steady focus, that calm precision that had once aimed through chaos and fire. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, Reeves would stand by his porch and watch the mist roll across the fields. It reminded him of Mortain, of the ridge where visibility had meant life or death. He would reach into his coat pocket and pull out the small piece of glass he had kept all those years, the fragment of his cracked sight. The edges were worn now, smoothed by time and touch. When the sun hit it just right, it still glimmered like it had that day on the battlefield. One spring, decades later, a young journalist visited him. She was writing a piece about forgotten war heroes, the ones whose names never made it into textbooks. Reeves was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to talk. They sat on his porch as the evening light softened the world around them. "You were known as the most accurate gunner in France," she said, glancing at her notes. "How did you do it with a broken sight?" Reeves chuckled softly, his eyes distant. "Everyone keeps asking that," he said. "Truth is, I stopped relying on what I could see and started trusting what I knew. When everything breaks around you, your tools, your orders, your nerves, you find something deeper to guide you." The journalist wrote that down slowly, her pen trembling slightly. "And what guided you?" He looked at the horizon for a long moment before answering. "The idea that if I could hold that line, someone else might live to go home. That was enough." After that interview, Reeves went back to his quiet life. The story appeared in a small veterans magazine under the title, "The Gunner Who Saw Through the Fog." It was read by only a handful of people, but among them were soldiers who'd fought at Mortain. Some wrote letters to thank him, others to tell him they had driven past that ridge years later and remembered his stand. Reeves never replied, but he kept every letter in a drawer. When he passed away in 1978, the local newspaper ran a short obituary. It mentioned his service in France, his calm demeanor, and the fact that he'd worked with broken things and made them whole. At his funeral, a handful of fellow veterans attended, most of them older men with canes and medals that glinted faintly in the sunlight. They didn't speak much, but when the ceremony ended, one of them approached Reeves's old workbench in the barn. There, beside a stack of tools, lay the cracked sight, still gleaming faintly. Someone had placed it inside a small wooden box, its lid engraved with a single line. "If it still sees the target, it still works." The veteran smiled sadly, closed the box and whispered, "You always did, Dan." Years later, the French government restored the Mortain battlefield and built a small memorial near Hill 214. Among the plaques and stones was one bearing a simple inscription, "To the men who held the ridge," and "To one gunner who saw clearly through a broken lens." Visitors sometimes stop there and stare at the photograph etched into the metal, a young man, leaning from his Sherman tank, eyes steady behind soot and dust. To most, it's just another face from a long-ago war. But to those who know the story, it's something else entirely. A reminder of how courage often comes from imperfection, how clarity can exist even through cracks. Teachers bring their students there. Veterans leave their medals beside the stone. And sometimes, when the fog drifts in from the valley below, the ridge looks the same as it did in 1944. Quiet, ghostly, sacred. The legend of Daniel Reeves grew not because of what he destroyed, but because of what he refused to surrender, the will to see clearly when the world around him shattered. In the end, his story became more than just a tale of war. It became a reflection of every soldier who ever fought with broken weapons, broken nerves, or broken hearts, and still found a way to aim true. For history doesn't only remember perfection, it remembers endurance, It remembers those who held their ground when the rest of the world blurred, and somewhere deep in the soil of that French ridge, the echoes of Reeves's final shot still linger, a quiet reminder that sometimes the clearest vision of all comes through a crack in the glass. In the chaos of war, Sergeant Daniel Reeves proved that sometimes the sharpest aim doesn't come from perfect tools, but from unbreakable focus. His cracked gunsight, once seen as a flaw, became a symbol of what made him unstoppable. Through smoke, through fear, through the roar of tanks and the thunder of artillery, Reeves learned to see not with his eyes, but with instinct, memory and heart. When others broke under pressure, he stood firm. When visibility vanished, he found clarity. His story reminds us that true precision in war and life comes from within. You don't need everything to be perfect to make your mark. Sometimes the cracks are what let the light in. As decades pass and new generations forget the names carved into history, stories like Reeves's remind us why courage still matters. It's not about glory or medals. It's about holding your ground when the world demands you fall back. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that strength often hides in imperfection, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more forgotten stories of war courage and the human spirit. Because somewhere out there, another broken sight is still aiming true, and it deserves to be remembered.